Hello lovelies. In today's video I am going to pretentiously waffle at you about politics in creative endeavours while inexplicably dressed as a bear because it's cold. So, given, well, you know, everything. Yeah, given all of that, some of you may well be tempted to express your resistance through your RPG campaigns or your products. I'm not going to tell you not to do it, or at least I'm not going to order you not to do it, but I'm going to implore you, at least as far as commercial products go, not to do it consciously and directly to the extent that so many people do. Because if you do, most of the time you end up making less good art, and you end up alienating potential audiences, and you end up having the opposite effect ideologically to the one that you want to have, right? I've made a handful of political games myself, a few activist-y type ones rather than political ones per se, single issue. Yeah, it's kind of not really politics. So I'm speaking somewhat from experience here. These games ran the gamut from free or pay what you want ones, making a general sort of activist point, like Imagination or The Little Grey Book, which was more kind of social commentary, to things much more zeroed in on something specific. In the political zeitgeist, Privilege Check and Gamergate the card game. But even when it comes to those last two, one was a very definite satire, and the other was a modelling of the issues and discourse that were at play, whatever side I might have happened to have been on. Politics and tabletop RPGs have long been intertwined, but mainly as a backdrop or a motivation somewhere in there in the world for heroic adventures. The player's actions might at best further the ambitions of one particular lord or a crime boss over another. Perhaps the characters would get involved more directly, working for a patron or becoming a political force themselves, maybe making things better, maybe making things worse. Perhaps the game that was most explicit in all of this was Underground, which actually had a mechanic for changing the state of local politics in the area and so on in which you were involved, or at least social indicators. But it didn't pass any particular judgment on which way you wanted to influence things. You could have gone any which way. So what tended not to be the case necessarily was a game as propaganda. Satire, sure. Commentary, perhaps. Certain sets of historical or political presuppositions of the author, certainly. But very rarely directly political. And I think it's important to draw this distinction, this line between political and political. Politics can make a great framework for plots and stories, but there's a difference between that and this kind of propagandizing. There's a difference between politics as the interplay of power blocks within the world and politics as in, here's my ideology, I'm going to preach it to you. So, there were some notable exceptions, I suppose, throughout the history of gaming. Perhaps The Price of Freedom could be interpreted as a political RPG, a West End Games product set in a Soviet-occupied America. But that was really at the time more of a chillingly plausible possibility, something that was in a lot of fiction at the time. It's part of the general sort of background radiation of the Cold War, and whatever your personal politics might have been, the idea of being a resistance group in an occupied state, you know, that's an interesting premise. But yeah, that was just kind of the background radiation to all our lives after World War II. Paranoia, perhaps, another one, also by West End Games at the time. Slightly different view, satirising the science fiction of the 1970s and the other side of the Cold War, the eponymous paranoia that was everywhere, the McCarthyism. It's why it's lost some of its sting and lustre in today's world, though there have been attempts to make it more about terrorism or other bugbears. However, barely any games have ever been political in terms of being engines of propaganda. That is a much more recent sort of thing, though the kind of people that make propagandistic games tend to assume that everyone else's games are also propagandistic. They project what they do onto others, which is how you get nonsense like D&D as colonialist or racist or whatever else. They choose to make their games preachy and political, and so they assume everyone else has. There were exceptions again in the past. Dragon Raid is one of the only ones that really comes to mind. That was kind of a reaction to the Satanic Panic, gamifying Christianity as part and parcel of a misguided attempt to challenge D&D with an overtly Christian RPG that didn't really understand what RPGs were or how they worked. And as I said, meant to kind of counter the imaginary satanic nature of D&D itself. Of course, some people like to assert that everything is political, which robs the term of any effective meaning, turning it into a semantics-free grunt. So you can pretty much safely tell those people to fuck off. More recently, however, we see much more overt politicization of games, from company reps telling people they're not welcome to play the game, to purging the mere mention of difficult or problematic or even real-world elements, to outright trying to tell you that you can and can't play a particular company's game or line of games, and even telling people to return their books, which doesn't strike me as a particularly good business decision. Political themes and ideas are great. Intrigue, skullduggery, espionage, blackmail, ideological conflict going on between groups in the world, all fantastic fodder for stories. But this bastardization, this propagandistic use of RPGs, yeah, it is a pretty new phenomenon, and it tends to lead to shitty game communities, shitty products, and needlessly precarious companies, as well as, and perhaps most importantly, removing RPGs as a third space. A third space is somewhere where you meet and mingle people that you don't necessarily agree with, but in an affirming and social kind of setting. A pub here in England is a third space. People from all walks of life go there for a drink and some food and some company, and you get to mix and you get to see that other people are real people, not just NPCs in rubber masks or whatever else. And so politicizing third spaces like RPGs, like fandoms, is massively counterproductive, in my not so humble and somewhat experienced opinion. Poorly handled, overt political messaging can turn an immersive game into an unengaging sermon. This doesn't mean you should stay away from political or ideological themes necessarily, nor that you shouldn't have personal politics of your own. You just need to not be a boring boor about it. One of the biggest missteps across media is overt, heavy-handed messaging that prioritizes ideology over everything else. We can all recognize that when we look at North Korean media that gets shown in the West, or when we look at the kinds of children's programming that groups like Hamas put out with their version of Mickey Mouse encouraging people to kill the Jews. You know, we can always recognize it, but we seem to be somewhat blind when it comes to other propagandizing within our own spaces or within our own ideology. It seems to be hard for people to recognize that they're being, well, not just as overt, but on the same path. When a game's politics are so blatant that they overshadow everything else, and they have no artistry, cleverness, or obfuscation to them, it runs the risk of just becoming more propaganda, mere propaganda, rather than art or entertainment. Take, for example, The Watch from 2017. It's a game about fighting the shadow, I think. A force that represents toxic masculinity. Does anyone even remember this game? Until I mentioned it. It won an award. While it was praised for its unique theme, many found its lack of nuance and clear ideological and misandrist bent incredibly off-putting, especially in a hobby that is still male-dominant in its demographics. So, again, a rather unsound business decision to potentially piss off the majority of your potential audience, perhaps. It forced a binary perspective on a complex issue, leaving little room for player interpretation or interaction with the themes beyond that dictated by the book. Even earlier, say 2005-ish, Blue Rose by Green Ronin sought to create an inclusive, progressive, romantic fantasy type setting, but faced criticism for being too utopian, eliminating much of the conflict that makes narratives compelling. And therefore, without ideological or other tension, the setting felt static, staid, small c conservative, and extremely artificial to some players and commentators. And it even resorted to magic to handwave and prevent any serious disruption to the in-game status quo. Of course, in a game, you can still choose to ignore these sorts of things, but then the game is working against you all the way in their assumptions, in their setting, often their very rules and support. Outside of TTRPGs, we can look at Star Wars. The sequel trilogy suffered from inserting contemporary political messaging in a way that many viewers found unsubtle and distracting and hypocritical, since they claimed to be making bold political stands but then self-censored for certain markets like China. The Last Jedi, in particular, faced criticism for its crude handling of themes like wealth inequality and arms dealing in a way that felt disconnected from the story's core themes and elements, and tacked on in a way that really detracted from the other plots. The original Star Wars trilogy certainly had elements of political and social commentary to it. Leia kicking butt was a feminist aspect, but she just did it. There wasn't a lecture attached to it. The Empire are obviously Nazis, and there was also a certain underlying commentary on Vietnam at the time, but none of it was really boldly, crudely stuffed into your face. It was just there. It was in the background, and all the more effective for it. Now, if you feel that you absolutely must bring ideological themes into your campaign or a game that you're going to publish, the best way to do it is through the application of the aforementioned allegory and metaphor, rather than blunt force messaging. Games that succeed in this approach, media as a whole that succeeds in this approach, allows players or viewers or whatever else to engage with the themes on their own terms without feeling that they're being preached to. It's arguably also more effective, allowing people to arrive at their own conclusions on their own initiative and to draw natural conclusions from well-presented and engaging material. Or to just ignore it as a whole, if they want. For instance, Cyberpunk 2020, 1988, and its successor, Cyberpunk Red, 2020. These explore themes of corporate overreach, a loss of humanity, the effect of technology upon humanity, economic disparity, and societal and environmental collapse. These themes are deeply political, but they are presented as an organic part of the setting, a consequence, a background, rather than necessarily an explicit ideological statement. You can play a corpo if you want. often it's about surviving or making enough money to ride out what seems to be the end of the world. It doesn't need or feel the need to tell you over and over and over, this is bad. Players can engage with the themes as much or as little as they wish, at least on that deeper level. The X-Men comics are a prime example from broader nerd media, and one I often reach for in order to explain the difference between progressive and woke scoldery. While initially inspired by the civil rights movement, the themes of prejudice, fear of the other, and systemic oppression have remained flexible enough and universal enough that the X-Men have remained a potent storytelling force throughout decades, until recently. This has allowed different audiences to project contemporary issues onto the story. This adaptability keeps the narrative fresh and engaging. Unfortunately, in more recent times, the universalist approach of older X-Men stories has been discarded in favour of a far more blunt application that tends to turn away the very people that they should be seeking to reach with their message. I mean, everyone has felt outcast, misunderstood, or unjustly treated at some point. And that universal message of you're not alone, solidarity, of being better people than others expect people like you to be, that is a powerful thing. The specific messages don't tend to do that. Anti-mutant prejudice as fictional sidesteps real-world confusion and entanglements and allows people to project their own meaning and situation onto it, or to come to a revelation themselves based on it. Similarly, the Witcher franchise presents political themes like nationalism, xenophobia, and economic inequality, even racism. But it does so through a richly textured world where different perspectives are explored, and the main character, while often drawn into these things as a reluctant participant, is mostly an outsider to them, a wanderer and a vagabond without such direct ties to the politics, most of the time, depending who he's boning at the time. Players and readers are not told what to think, but are given that space to explore and make their own judgments from their in-game experience. There is subtlety, there is artistry to that, and so the material can be enjoyed on multiple levels and in multiple different ways. A major pitfall of political TTRPGs is falling into what I repeatedly call the Christian rock problem. Christian rock is usually bad, and it is often criticised for prioritising its message over making good music. Now, this doesn't apply to gospel and other things that have stood the test of time. Specifically, this is a Christian rock or a Christian pop problem. Jesus just doesn't shred like Satan does, and most of the satanic rock bands are being ironic, not serious, in trying to evangelise their Satanism or whatever else. The same problem occurs in TTRPGs that prioritise their political messaging over compelling mechanics and narratives and so on. If the gameplay or story feels secondary to an ideological goal that is being relentlessly pursued, then players will disengage. Gamers will disengage. Now, passion can overcome this to an extent, and ideology isn't quite so susceptible as religion to doing this. The first couple of Rage Against the Machine albums, for example, pretty good. Passionate, breaking into the industry, the rawness and the energy carried it forward. But what are they like now? Why are the later albums less good? Messaging over art and less time to winnow out what was just generally good. Propaganda, by definition, is designed to persuade rather than to entertain, or probably more accurately, to bully rather than to entertain. Persuasion comes when you do it more subtly. But this does make for weak storytelling, as it tends to remove ambiguity and choice, stakes, risk, conflict. If there's a one true wayism to something, then it doesn't make sense for characters to agonize about things, and yet that is often what draws us in. When players feel forced into a singular perspective without room for any exploration, the game ceases to be interactive and instead becomes a lecture and haranguing, bullying. A good TTRPG allows for multiple viewpoints on the game and within the game, and gives players the freedom to navigate the world in ways that feel particularly meaningful to them. A game like Eclipse Phase, for example, manages to tackle transhumanism, surveillance and corporate power while still prioritising player agency and compelling mechanics. The setting does not dictate moral conclusions, but presents challenges for players to interpret, and a divided surviving humanity trying different modes of civilization to survive the loss of Earth. Of course, then the company itself fucked it up, Posthuman Studios. Their game happened to appeal to a lot of early tech bros, tech libertarians, and they formed a significant subset of the fanbase for their games, one which they deliberately alienated with their real-world political demands and pronouncements. So that's another pitfall. Even if your game doesn't do it, you might do it. Political themes and ideological themes can certainly enrich a TTRPG, adding depth and relevance to the world and the characters. But there is, as I said, this difference between political games and propagandistic games, just like there's a difference between progressive values and woke values and presentation and how people go about accomplishing these ends. For a political game to succeed, it must balance its themes with strong gameplay and avoid overt preachiness. It must utilise allegory effectively. The moment someone feels preached at is the moment you lose them. Games that embrace nuance, ambiguity and player agency will always resonate more than those that simply dictate a message and insist on absolute obedience to that message, however unrealistic that demand might be. The goal should be to make a thought-provoking experience that causes people to mull these things over, to consider other perspectives through the medium of the fiction. They shouldn't be a one-dimensional polemic. In the end, a well-crafted TTRPG should make players think, but not tell them what to think. So if you do insist on making an ideological game, I believe it's important that, first and foremost, it's a good game. That should be a no-duh moment, but it is true that quite a lot of financially successful Kickstarters for games, if not artistically successful ones, have placed their ideology first and everything else second, and have turned their products into papal indulgences, virtue signalling and exercises. So you show that you're a good person by backing a game that is entirely focused on a particular theme or made by a particular kind of person, but that doesn't necessarily make for good games. The odds are against you. So don't hit people over the head with your ideology, rather construct the game and world in such a way that it is demonstrated and shown with subtlety and artistry, and can even be challenged or gone against in the world, where you can play evil characters or whatever else. Interaction and playing makes people think, spend a little time as the other, or play a character or a setting that is outside of their own ideologies and prejudice. If you universalise the message like the X-Men used to, your central message, whatever it is, can probably be broadened out, and this hides the specifics while allowing people to come to the conclusions that you want them to edge them towards. The X-Men's message of tolerance and acceptance, of people unfairly demonised, and the extremes that this kind of hatred can engender on both sides. That's applicable to LGBT issues, race issues, and plenty of others. But by not being about any of those issues specifically and using the allegory of mutation, it applies itself more broadly and allows people to come to that conclusion themselves, organically. I think it's also important to create a line of separation between your politics and your games. some people will react negatively, however circumspect you are, and those people can fuck off and all. But telling people no fascists are allowed to play my game is not only futile, but it risks alienating people who are merely conservative, centrist, or apolitical, but who get called Nazis by bad actors out in the world. That doesn't mean you can't have your own ideological bent, activity, activism, and can't express it, just that there should be a line of separation between that and your games. If you're serious about your ideology, and you believe it to be present in your games and books, whether you try or not, I mean, don't you want to reach people on the other side? Don't you want them reading it and being exposed to your ideas and maybe moderating their own? Isn't that what you're wanting to accomplish, rather than just preaching to the converted? Take their money, spend it on something they'd hate, if it makes you feel better. Take money from sales to fascists and spend it on something super gay from a racial minority lesbian publishing house. Whatever. Spends the same, and they might be exposed to some more tolerant ideas that lead them to moderate their ideas. So that's where I'm at with this. Which isn't to say that all political art is bad. It's just it's a hurdle to get over. And I think a lot of these problems are specific to the kinds of media that we're involved in. Games, comics, films, TV series, and so on. If you turn it into preaching, then it's a lot less effective. Whereas if you just let the story unfold, use allegory, leave things unstated, allow people to arrive at what you want them to arrive at naturally and organically, then it's better art, and most importantly, for people who are stuck on ideology, it's more effective at getting your point across. Sang. Sup. I'm reliably informed that I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so here I am, pimping my stuff. You can buy most of the shit that I make over at post-mort.com. Hope to see you there.
Word to your mom.